Hey guys, I'm Meg, newly minted at TSA, former think tanker, DoDer, Hill staffer, where I learned all my bad habits. With me is Tim Weston, who leads our strategy and performance team and our cybersecurity policy efforts. He's also the guy who wrote and helped implement the TSA cybersecurity roadmap, the first one ever, and is a lawyer by training. And I would just like to say that that was written far before Colonial Pipeline, which we'll just go ahead and jump into now. So since I'm the new kid at TSA, I'm going to interview Tim about the threats that TSA faces today and tomorrow in the cyber realm, and hopefully we can work in a couple of Star Wars references unless you've heard them all day long. So, Tim, question one is easy. Almost a year ago, gas stopped flowing on the East Coast because of a ransomware attack, but that's not where the story begins. Tell us about the hard work that was going on before that incident, and then walk us through TSA's response through today.
Excellent. Yeah, no, almost exactly a year ago. I remember the Friday, May 7th phone call I got from multiple people alerting me to what was going on. It was an interesting few days just trying to figure out, get the right information in. But your question, though, really was what was going on before that. So everyone's probably well aware of the security directives that TSA issued relatively quickly following Colonial. So we had the first one that was issued at the end of May, 1st of June, which was primarily on incident reporting. That was actually in direct response to Colonial. There was a large concern with the number of ransomware incidents that were going on that had been starting to affect critical infrastructure. You had the JBS meatpacking that happened almost a week later after Colonial. So there was a lot of concern about getting the information in and making sure that everyone had the right information in front of them. So we sat down, we worked with our partners at CISA, we worked across the interagency with our colleagues at the National Security Council. And from a quick win really was, look, have all these companies assign a cybersecurity coordinator who's going to be available 24/7. They're the single point of contact to report anything into CISA, and then from there CISA will do its thing and share everything out with those who need to know. We asked everyone to do some self-assessments against the pipeline security guidelines that TSA had issued in 2018. That was, again, just kind of a first step to, at least on the pipeline side, to start getting an understanding from our stakeholders what their maturity was. So those were the two main points out of SD1. But SD2 was the one that really was interesting. And that was the one that's gained a lot of the attention lately and since it's been issued. And that one was actually intended to be SD1. TSA had been working with many others across the interagency with CISA, DOE, PHMSA, the NSC again, and DOD on a set of mitigation measures in direct response to threats that we had been seeing coming out of China. So if you actually go back and you look at the joint CISA FBI cybersecurity advisory that was issued on July 20th, 2021, that tells a lot of the story. But what it doesn't tell, again, was that interagency work that had been going into that for months ahead of time on how do we secure the pipeline sector against some very real threats that were out there. So that was, in government, world or in the bureaucracy, issuing those mitigation measures within 90 days of Colonial, everyone was like, wow, that was fast. And it was, but it was fast because
there was a lot of work behind it.
Yeah, we had been meeting for quite a few months before that, socially distanced across the room, throwing dry erase markers at each other, trying to, whiteboard out different ideas on how we actually would respond to the threats that we were seeing, primarily from China, but also from Russia, North Korea, and Iran. I mean, a lot of those mitigation measures that we had in there could apply to any of the big four nation-state threats that are out there.
Can you talk a little bit about, and this isn't one I haven't told you about, but tell the different threat actors. How has that changed? Has that been surprising for TSA? I mean, you've got the strategic role, so it's not surprising to you, but as you work across, has that been kind of an education to explain the different kinds of threat actors? Was Colonial a huge surprise because, we're government and we think about nation states? How did you experience that?
So I don't think that it wasn't a big surprise to me, and it wasn't, I think, a big surprise to those in the across the intelligence community. I mean, we had been tracking and seeing ransomware in particular as a rising threat. I mean, I think every threat briefing and industry engagement briefing we had given for years, it's like, the number one threat out there really is ransomware. The nation state actors, are going to be those persistent actors. Those are the long-term threats that we have to build up mitigation to, but kind of the transient nature of ransomware was concerning because you didn't know when they were going to hit, what they were going to hit. The nation states, we have a pretty good idea of, mostly where they're going, what they want to do. I mean, China by and large is really focused on, economic espionage activities for the most part. The Russians just kind of like to see things burn, but they do have a strategy to how they go about it. Yeah. The North Koreans want to, they're probably a bigger actor in the ransomware space because they're trying to raise money, and very similar with the Iranians. But the Iranians have gotten a little bit more active in some of these spaces as well. But the ransomware piece has always been a bit of a wild card, but it's something we had been tracking.
Which is one tool in the toolbox, right?
Yep.
So publicly reported twice hacktivist groups, which are not even the same as criminal groups, attacked the Belarusian train system earlier this year as part related to the Ukraine conflict. So anyone reading the news understands that there's significant cyber threats to the surface, what we call the surface sector. So that's rail, that's highway, that's pipelines. What else am I missing?
Yeah, rail pipelines
and cargo.
Yeah, over the road bus and mass.
So talk to us about your strategy. What are the future threats in the surface space? Cities and towns slowly, actually probably more slower than we'd like, are getting more connected. And that makes the cyber playing field bigger. So what can we do to get ahead, and what are you doing to get ahead of the threat, of the evolution of the threat, and tell us how you're working with stakeholders now in the transportation sector to think over the horizon? Because they've got the today problems, but how are you also simultaneously doing the tomorrow? Yeah,
so in many respects, they are very connected. I'm going to use my first, obligatory Star Wars reference here.
Yay.
If you think about Coruscant, the main, the capital of the Republic, and how you have all of these different vehicles kind of flying around between buildings, most of them autonomous. I mean, so those autonomous vehicles, that's an area that we're really looking at, especially over on the highway carriers and over the road bus. The different, like chaining of vehicles, semis and cargo. That's a threat or a threat space that we're looking at, that we're starting to engage a lot with the manufacturers on, and working with them and trying to get an understanding of what kind of technology are they building into those systems. Something that's, pervasive, I think, across everything we do really is supply chain management. That's a lot. We continue to use a lot of technology that doesn't have security in mind. I think most people here understand that. I mean, especially on hard infrastructure, so like rail, pipeline, things like that. I mean, the ICS systems, the OT systems and networks that are there never really had security in mind when they were developed. And we just keep bolting different, things on top of them and saying, oh, well, this is going to secure this and this is going to help here, and don't really think about the interconnectedness of how those systems are supposed to work together. So really starting to work with a lot of the manufacturers again. So not, I think from a strategic standpoint, you'll see us working much more with the manufacturers of the actual equipment, not so much the actual stakeholders themselves. So not like your Amtraks, your, cargo carriers, things like that, but more working with the actual, the vehicle manufacturers, the manufacturers of the specific, ICS and OT, devices themselves, to help really start building security features into those systems. Now, from there, I mean, you kind of take that same concept into, you asked about, cities and towns, as we start to see more of them using AI and machine learning to, manage traffic, to regulate other aspects of the infrastructure, mass transit, for example, scheduling. We want to work with them ahead of time so that they're thinking about the security concerns up front. because we want to make sure that everything is working the way it's supposed to. Our job at TSA really is to secure all modes of transportation. So that's everything. So we've started working even locally in Virginia. I've met with a couple of different groups that are working with, like Verizon, for example, on some of the smart city, technology that's out there to try and get an understanding of what they're looking at. How can we incorporate, different security models? There's been some talk over the years through the interagency with between TSA, DOT, a little bit more broadly, and Department of Commerce about building out like a cyber range. And that's something still a bit on the horizon, but I think there's some places out there where we can kind of leverage some of those ranges, for example, to really, bring in manufacturers, bring in other stakeholders on the front end, test those systems, look at what the security controls and protocols are, and then work with them to, ensure that that's built in. So that's kind of what we're looking at now.
So one thing that many might not know about TSA is that we are actually very well attuned to, started in airports, but it expanded to lots of other modes of transportation, insider threat. Talk to us about the insider threat and cybersecurity, and how is TSA, to the extent you can talk about it, kind of thinking about that? I mean, is that part of your conversations with the companies? Because it's less on the manufacturing side, that's more of a nearer term. Mm-hmm. Tell us a bit about how we think about that threat.
No, so again, I'm going to use my second Star Wars plug here. I was only given a few that I could use. So R2-D2, I think, is the greatest hacker in cinematic history. And the only reason I say that is because, first of all, we all know he got into the Death Star. He found an open IT port. He got through the system, moved laterally, pulled down the Death Star plans. Oh, and then he went in and started manipulating the OT networks, the trash compactors. And, he does this throughout the entire series. So, but he's also an insider threat. So, I love that question. We are working closely with airports on insider threats because in many cases, that's a concern. Those networks that we see within airports, we have a phrase in TSA, if you've seen one airport, you've seen one airport. So most of the time, those airports, though, their networks and the systems that are in there are usually pretty self-contained. So, and
just a note for those who aren't familiar about that comment, that's because so many airports have their own CEOs and they have their own budgets and they're all different, and they have their own buildings that are not exactly well structured. So
yeah, and an airport is essentially it's a mini city in its own right. You have wastewater, water, ICS systems, traffic management, HVAC, electrical, but a lot of them, again, are rather self-contained. So from an insider threat perspective, we actually have an insider threat roadmap as well that from a strategic standpoint outlines how TSA engages with our stakeholders to help mitigate insider threat issues. From a cybersecurity perspective, that includes some very specific protocols and measures on things that are actually pretty practical. And I think most entities out there probably do, but securing your server rooms, for example, do you have the right security controls there, CCTV? It's pretty basic stuff in some respects, but it's effective. If you can control, that one space there, and, then you're pretty good. Now moving out, if you kind of then move out, we work very closely with them through the Aviation Cyber Initiative, which is, it's a working group within the government that's tri-chaired by DHS, DOD, and FAA. The DHS tri-chair actually just moved to TSA in February with the passage of the FY22 budget. But through that, we go out, we do some airport assessments. There's some different trainings that we offer for airport staff. Insider threat is a big part of that. So, making sure that they're aware of what those threats are. And then working with, again, some of the airports, especially the smaller ones, on things like Wi-Fi configurations, doing Wi-Fi training. You'd probably be shocked and amazed at the number of airports that use Wi-Fi as their basic airport operations. I've seen them using Wi-Fi for tracking their fuel trucks, and it's like, wow, that's not a good idea. There's probably a better way to do that. So here's some ideas of not to do that. Yeah. So a lot of it's training. Even though TSA is in our nature a regulatory agency, a lot of what we're doing is really more focused on building up resilience, and helping improve security. I mean, that's
We'd rather regulate last.
Yes, we are not here to be the internet cops. We're not here to, hit people with the big regulatory hammer. But, if you look at our strategies that we've, the cybersecurity roadmap, the insider threat roadmap, we've got a new UAS roadmap that'll be coming out soon, hopefully. A lot of the focus there really is on building resilience and building partnerships and engaging with our stakeholders to improve security. I mean, it's worked well in the 20 years that TSA's been in existence. We're still very young from an agency perspective, but the fact that we're co-located in all these airports with the airport owners and operators makes it easier for us to engage with them and work with them to improve security.
So can we talk about advanced air mobility as one of those over the horizons? And you're talking with FAA recently. You went and gave a presentation about a couple of things. How should this group think about advanced air mobility from a cyber perspective and a general threat perspective? And what is it, in case you don't know? So
advanced air mobility or urban air mobility, again, using that Star Wars Coruscant example, the cars, and they're kind of flying around, without drivers between buildings. Or the Jetsons, if you want to use that, they're essentially large autonomous drones, if you will, quadcopter type vehicles that hold, a couple of, up to 8 or 10 passengers, and will be used to, bypass a lot of the land-based transportation. So I know there's a pilot program coming, I think, to Las Vegas, and where you'll see, in theory, you'd be able to be screened before you get on the AAM or UAM, and then fly directly to the airport on the sterile side. So where, past screening, and then go straight onto your plane. So instead of taking a taxi, you hop on one of these quadcopters. They're completely autonomous. They use encrypted communications to guide them, and with different nodes set up through the city to help guide them. So that's kind of that horizon case. I know FAA and NASA have been doing a lot of work on just the safety side of it, but if you flip that,
we gotta secure who's in it.
Well, we have
access to it.
We have to secure who's in it,
and then the digital seat.
And then we have to secure the systems themselves. So the model I like to think about, especially when we engage with FAA has the safety side of the coin. TSA is the security side of the coin. So we are working very, with our partners. Again, this is early stuff, but working with FAA, working with NASA. One of the things we're going to be doing, hopefully, is setting up a dedicated cybersecurity working group with NASA, with FAA, and with some of the manufacturers for these AAMs or UAMs to start looking at, all right, again, what are the security controls you're considering? What are the standards that we need to use in place of that? And then how do we assess the effectiveness, on the back end? Because the last thing we want is a bunch of, big quadcopters with people in them, all of a sudden being compromised and, either being told to turn left or to go straight down or go straight up. I mean, there's many different things that could happen. So starting to work in that, those are, that's, I'd like to say that's a horizon case, but I mean, that technology and those initiatives are already here. So that's really not a horizon.
And interesting, if you talk to industry, they'll say that it's closer than autonomous vehicles because you got less to worry about. I mean, from an infrastructure perspective.
From an infrastructure perspective,
you don't have to worry about pedestrians. You don't have to,
Exactly.
Frankly,
it is easier to develop that and implement those types of transportation. Again, because you're in the air. I mean, you're not dealing with, again, that hard infrastructure that you have elsewhere.
So I'll ask one last question, then turn it over to you guys. So especially on this day, we have to talk about the final frontier. So we're already in the air. Let's go higher. A significant role TSA plays, as we're kind of alluding to, is in vetting personnel, as well as the security of physical and digital assets. So what's next for the agency? Space tourism.
I definitely see, with the rise and development of space tourism, spaceports, TSA's authority there. And like Meg said, I'm an attorney by training, so I like to always go back to the law on that. Spaceports are really no different than airports. I mean, it's a port that conveys people and probably in goods in many cases, between locations. So I definitely see TSA moving into the vet as this grows into the vetting of those passengers, vetting of the personnel at those ports. So again, very similar to what we do on the airport side for your airport workers. Again, that kind of goes back to our insider threat issues, making sure that you have, who you think you have in front of you has the right access to the right place within the airport. And then outside of that is the security of the systems themselves, of the aircraft or the spacecraft, going in and out of the spaceports. Again, I see those as very similar to the AAMs and UAMs, because a lot of the, encryption of the communication systems, for example, those are going to be areas that I think we need to work very closely with the manufacturers on. Because again, the last thing we want is a big rocket or a small rocket, being compromised and used,
Especially if they're cheaper, faster, lighter.
Exactly. So I do see us, that I think is, again, a horizon issue for TSA, but I think it's an area that you'll see us moving into, both from a physical security and from a cybersecurity perspective.
All right. Any questions? Over to you guys.
Yes.
So on Security Directive 2, obviously that's kind of gotten the most of the pushback from industry. I'd just be curious, kind of any takeaways you have, lessons learned on both process as well as anything on the actual requirements from kind of what's happened over the last year with that directive.
So it's been interesting. Definitely been in the press lately, and it's been one of those things.
Very natural.
Price and board, everyone.
Totally natural.
So by its nature, the security directive was developed without a lot of engagement. I mean, there was engagement with the stakeholders. Now, because of the threats that we were seeing, you don't have the same time period like you would with a normal regulation where you have, an extended notice and comment period. But there was engagement with stakeholders. We went out and talked to a few key stakeholders, some of the industry associations. And again, it was developed in very close coordination with our partners across the federal government. I mean, CISA, DOE, PHMSA, they were all a part of this. Coast Guard was another one that was actually a very big help in the development of SD2. From lessons learned, I think you'll see in the future, so a move away from the more compulsory, mandatory nature to a more outcome-focused, compliant nature. So, instead of it being, thou shalt, patch within 7 days or 14 days, to develop a patching program that implements in a timely manner patches that come out. And we know that, like, for your IT systems, I mean, that's easier to do, right? I mean, most organizations should have a patching program in place. It's the IT side that's a little bit more difficult. Those IT systems are,
The OT side.
the OT side, where you have to go in and test that OT environment, and in many cases, system by system, network by network, to make sure that the patch doesn't break something else. So working with companies to give them a little bit more time to implement things like that, I think will be good. Network segmentation, another big area that, I think, especially in the pipeline side, and I'll say across all transportation. I don't want to be specific, but across all of transportation, I think most of your bigger organizations, your bigger stakeholders already do a lot of these things, right? It's the middle and small organizations that don't, for various reasons. They may not have the staff, they may not have the budget. So working with them to have more time to implement some of these security features like network segmentation, working with them to actually develop, what that architecture looks like, even in many cases, because some of the things we've heard is, in some instances, they're like, well, what are you talking about? And that's always scary, right? If they're not asking the right questions, or they're asking the wrong questions, okay, we need to have a different conversation. So I think you'll see that, and you'll see that across the board with all of our security programs. So following SD1, SD2 on the pipeline side, we issued a Security Directive 1 for broader surface transportation stakeholders. So again, your rail entities, both passenger, freight rail, mass transit, over-the-road bus carriers, highway motor carriers. Again, very similar to what SD1 was, again, basic, have a cybersecurity coordinator, do some self-assessments, report incidents within a specific time frame. Same thing on the aviation side. So in December, we issued security program amendments to the aviation community. That first round was just to airports, air carriers, and air cargo security program holders. Last week, we extended that to some of the different, like the charter flights and what we call 12,500 air carriers or aviation entities. And so now we have everyone, at least under some version of SD1, cybersecurity coordinator, vulnerability assessment, incident reporting. That informs us, that helps give us a little bit more data on what kind of incidents we're seeing, so that helps drive where do we go from there, what are the next mitigation measures that go out there. So you want to look at that data, you want to continue to look at the threat reporting that's out there to help, determine where we go. Now, I think a lot of what we saw in SD2, again, password management programs, multi-factor authentication, network segmentation, patching, those are things that you will see, I think, be implemented across the board, again, to all the rest of the transportation stakeholders. Again, in an outcome-focused, compliant manner to, we want to work with them, let the entities, the stakeholders, develop a program, a plan of action to meet those goals. The assessment side of it, I think, will be a little bit more difficult, just because now instead of, assessing, kind of a cookie cutter approach, if you will, you're going to go in, it's going to take a little bit more time to work with them to assess the, compliance. But I think that's still a better model. And it actually, in my opinion, fosters more engagement and more communication. So you want to have those conversations with those entities, again, to make sure that they understand what we're asking them to do and help them get to where they need to go, finding resources, for example, to help build out those programs.